welcome to the Bronx, or welcome back to the Bronx, as the case may be. And I'm looking forward to hearing the stories from these inductees on what the Bronx has meant or still means to them, and how it has shaped them. Because it certainly shaped me, whether it was being scrappy or resourceful or having friends from different races and ethnic backgrounds or religious groups, or just being competitive with all the street games that we played here, or rooting for the Yankees and knowing what it's like to be a winner, because the Yankees were a winning team here for many, many years. So all these things are part of being from the Bronx and being in the Bronx. So we're going to hear their stories. Some life journeys brought them here to the Bronx, and some took the Bronx with them as they moved forward in their lives. Our first guest wrote a little speech, and he wanted to make some remarks and walk a little down memory lane and talk about some of the inspirations he's had. He's a New York City reporter. We've covered many stories together. He has been on the streets of New York City all his life. Please welcome WPIX TV reporter, Mr. Marvin Scott.
I'm touched and honored to receive this recognition tonight, because it not only brings me back to the Bronx, but it reconnects me to my Jewish heritage that was nurtured just blocks from here at the Mount Eden Jewish Center. You've been there, okay. I was bar mitzvahed there too. The Bronx is where dreams were born, my own dreams of tomorrows, that over the course of 50 years have evolved into reality and the fulfillment of those dreams. Now, as I look back at those formidable years, a kaleidoscope of memories fill my memory bank. You'll recognize some of them. Unlike the sweet-smelling dayflower, the official flower of the Bronx, I'm still tantalized by the scent of the Bronx. Now, that is of the pastrami and the corned beef, the sauerkraut and the sour pickles that wafted from the innards of Moscow's delicatessen and Jack's appetizing store on the ground floor of my 6th-floor building at 1585 Townsend Avenue. Now, these were the aromas that really set our building apart from any others on the block. You know, there are also the sounds that are indigenous of my neighborhood, like high cash clothes. Any of you remember that? That was the weekly refrain from the used clothing buyer walking up and down the street. How about the sound and the cry of "Seltzer man," pronouncing the arrival of our weekly supply of gaseous water, and of course, a bottle of, how many remember? You Bet syrup. Okay. I have remembrances of that building at the corner of Mount Eden in Townsend, and it wasn't simply an apartment building, it was more like a commune, a kibbutz, if you will. Our neighbors, they weren't neighbors, they were more like family. And the Jewish holidays, they were always special. The women would exchange recipes for the matzo balls, the brisket was terrific, and the turkey stuffing. We were one of the first families in the building to own a television set, all 6 inches, with a magnifying glass to make it a projection TV, all 10 inches. The apartment was always crowded. Friday night wrestling, Monday night the weekly episode of Molly Goldberg, Tuesday nights the Texaco Star Theater with Uncle Milty Milton Berle. Now often I'm asked how I develop my voice and to project the way I do. Well, it all began with those important breaking news, those bulletins shouted from my 4th-floor apartment window, like, "Hey, Danny, the Yankees won." The voice was a little higher and a little more nasal back then. My career, you could say, was ignited in the Bronx by a raging fire. I was about 14 back then, and one night I was watching television, heard the sirens look out the window, and night had turned to day, and there was this raging inferno just down the block of Mount Eden. I had a passion for photography back then. I raced out with my camera. I got there so fast, I was all set up before the firefighters were. I got a picture of a dozen windows, flames belching from the windows. The New York Daily News was New York's picture newspaper. I called them. They said, "Hey, kid, bring the pictures down." They immediately gave me a $2 messenger fee, which wasn't bad for a kid with $1 a week allowance. The next day, there was my picture, a quarter of the centerfold, with a credit line, a story on page 4, student finds picks pay, and I got a check for $25. Better than that, when I returned to my apartment building, all my neighbors were on the corner salivating to hear what happened. So the kid came back and I told them. I've been telling stories ever since. You could say that was the beginning of my career. I'm really honored to receive this distinguished recognition and to be back in the Bronx, just blocks from where my street sign hangs as a member of the New York and the Bronx Walk of Fame. Someday, I hope my grandchildren will visit to see the very streets where Grandpa grew up and achieve these honors. In closing, the days growing up in the Bronx were so innocent and so impressionable. My surroundings were filled with love and hope for the future, feelings that influenced my life and motivated me to achieve my goals. Growing up in the Bronx in the 50s, they were wonderful years. It's nice to be back home, and thank you. It's good to be here with our borough president and all of you tonight. Thank you.
Our next guest is world-renowned architect. Of course, you know him by his work at the new World Trade Center site, formerly called Ground Zero, I guess. But it's just moving along so beautifully, always something new and beautiful going up there. He was so instrumental in literally putting it on paper and seeing it rise up. Please congratulate architect Mr. Daniel Liebeskind.
Look, I was lucky to arrive by one of the last boats. Later on it became cheaper to fly. So I came by boat. My mother woke us up, my sister and myself, about 4:30 in the morning, and she said, "You're gonna see New York." And how can one ever forget the impossible dream that New York represents, the skyline of New York? For a kid of 13, that really, made my life into a different life. And the Statue of Liberty is not a rhetorical trope, as our government today believes. It's a real statue which says that America is the land of liberty and freedom. And I went straight from the boat to the Bronx. I don't even know how I got there, by subway, with my parents with a few suitcases, with no language. My parents had no jobs. And I really believe that everything that I do is related to the Bronx in a very deep way, because when you're 13 years old, you have no language, and you move. How lucky was I to move into the first public housing project built in the United States? Building number 1 of Amalgamated Garment Workers Union. And let's not forget that it was a mix of Democrats, socialists, anarchists, free enterprisers. It was a kind of a mecca of what we don't see in our country today, of tolerance, of intelligence, of true values. And really, I was so lucky then to go to the Bronx High School of Science, which is another Bronx institution. And I remember that when I applied to the School of Architecture in the Cooper Union, something happened to me. I was accepted to the school, but it's also a story of the Bronx. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. My parents slept in the living room. My sister and I, my sister was about 3 years older than I, we slept in one of the bedrooms. We had a very small kitchen in which my parents bought a very, very inexpensive Formica table. It was the only table in the house. I have to tell you the story because everything I do is related, of course, to that table. Unfortunately, it was not really a complete right-angle table. It had big round edges at the corners. So it was, straight for a very short distance and then round edges. Of course, at that time, there were no computers. You drew with a T-square. So I, had my T-square to do my work, and my teachers were all Bauhaus graduates. They were all actually refugees from Germany who came to America and taught many taught in that school at Cooper Union. So I had assignments to, draw bricks, courses of bricks, perfectly, in ink. Every brick, right-angled, one after the other, with a perfect in-between space. Now the problem was that when I was drawing, for a short distance, the right angle was completely correct, but I never knew at what point the curve started, and there would be a slight differentiation of the angle. And it was just slightly different. You never knew exactly at what point the right angle ended and another angle began. And I have to tell you, everything I do is really determined by the 359 other angles. You know, I've done some buildings with right angles, but I discovered actually in the Bronx, and because of my good fortune to live in a housing project with my family and with friends who had so many ideas, that's why I became an architect. And how strange, how funny, how ironic, how destinyful is the fact that I am the master planner of Ground Zero. And it's a site that represents all New Yorkers and all human beings. And my wife, Nina, is here. I met her upstate New York in a camp called Emcee, which was a Yiddish speaking camp. The language of the camp was Yiddish. And Emcee, as you know, in Hebrew and Yiddish means continuity. So there is true continuity via Jewish identity, via the Bronx and New York.
Very quickly, name your 3 favorite things about the Bronx.
3 favorite things. I would say it's diversity of voices that the Bronx represents. I had kids, my friends were Latino, they were African Americans, they were Italians, they were Jewish, they were immigrants, they were long-time residents. That's number 1. Number 2, I love the Bronx because of its topography. Bronx is probably the most beautiful borough in New York. Definitely. When you read the writings of Edgar Allan Poe, his letters, when you read Melville, they tell you very clearly that the place to come and look at the world is the Bronx. So I'm not the first one to say that. Number 3, what I love the Bronx is its determination not to give up. Anybody born in the Bronx is never going to give up. You know, if you were born in Brooklyn, maybe you will give up, but not in the Bronx.
Well, Daniel, let me be the first to hand out one of these beautiful awards.
Thank you.
Welcome and to the Bronx Jewish Hall of Fame class of 2017.
Thank you so much. Thank
Congratulations.
You. Oh, congratulations on our Thank you.
So let's present our next honoree, playwright, author, lecturer, Miss Miriam Hoffman, and she will be interviewed by her son and a previous inductee, Mr. Avi Hoffman. Welcome and congratulations.
Thank you. Mazel tov. Mwah. So last year I was very honored to be the 2016 inductee. My name is Avi Hoffman. I am an actor, performer, producer, and I owe my life to this little woman right here. I just want to introduce her very quickly as someone who not only was born and survived the frozen tundra in Siberia, she survived the slave labor camps in Soviet Stalinist Russia. She survived the DP camps in post-war Germany after the war. She came to America and became not only an award-winning playwright, who I've had the honor of working with many times, an educator who for 25 years taught Yiddish at Columbia University in New York, and is also a journalist who for 30 years has written a weekly column in the Yiddish Vorwärts. But she is the woman who gave me my life, and so I am very honored to be able to be here and ask you a few questions. And also soon to be the best-selling author of the book A Breed Apart, which actually is being released tomorrow and is available on Amazon. And tomorrow in Brooklyn at the Poe House Arena is the official event. Mom.
Yes.
Was Herze?
Als nicht kuschen.
Wie feels to
Nicht kuschen.
So, I was born in the Bronx, my mother was not, but I'm curious if you could tell everyone here this evening how you came to the Bronx and what was your first impression? What do you remember about the Bronx when you arrived?
We arrived in the Bronx in 1950 after we escaped Russia, and then we escaped Poland after the war, and the DP camps in Germany, post-war. Came to the Bronx I was 12, and went into Wilton Junior High School in the Bronx, and we were about 5 refugee girls, and we were given an IQ test. We didn't speak one single word of English, and because we didn't know what they want from us, we were classified retarded. So as a retard, we were sent to Morris High School. Morris High School, where I met also Colin Powell, who spoke Yiddish, by the way. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So do you remember your first address in the Bronx? Where did you live first?
We lived on Cypress Avenue, 136th Street.
Wow. Yeah.
Next to the Triborough Bridge.
Wow. And the story of my mother's life is written in the memoir, and so I've been reading it a lot. Can you tell me a little bit about how you think the Bronx influenced your life and your career?
Well, we moved to Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx, yes. And there was a Yiddish school on Bainbridge Avenue called Shalom Aleichem Shul 21. And they hired me to be the kindergarten teacher. I had a lot of fun teaching kindergarten.
And I was one of her students.
Yes, yes, yes. So this is where my teaching career began.
And do you think that ended up influencing how you began to teach later on in life?
Yes, I decided at that time that I will go up to first grade and second grade. But we also left for Israel in 1969, as you remember.
Yes.
And I began teaching there too. But this time I taught also in a Bundische Schule, on Kalischer 48 in Tel Aviv, Sephardic children, Yiddish. And I asked them, well, we had about 60 children from Iraq, Sudan, Morocco. I said, what do you need Yiddish for? And they said, we want to be Ashkenazim. So I began teaching in Israel at that time.
And the style that you taught was performance.
Performance.
Right.
I wasn't going to teach them Yiddish, grammar or whatever. What I decided to do is to translate Dr. Seuss into Yiddish. And they performed Dr. Seuss in Yiddish. There was also a play that I used called Lalkes, a musical play that was written in Medev Sanatorium in Warsaw, and so by children and teachers, and we put that on, and
that's how I started my career, performing for my mother at the Shalom Aleichem Volksschule 21 in the
yes.
Bronx.
Thank you both
I'm very honored
much.
to give you this.
Congratulations to the Hoffmans. Our next honoree, you probably know him by his work. He is not only an artist, but a medal and stamp designer, commemoratives, marking major historic events. He's at the top of his game in his field, Mr. Joel Iskowitz, who will sit down with Hall of Fame founding chair, Mr. Howard Teich. Congratulations.
He came all the way down from Woodstock, where he is now, misses the Bronx, just had to be here again, and we're delighted that you're here and inducting you into the class of 217. So the Bronx, tell us about it. What has it meant to you?
Well, just before I begin my memories of the Bronx and what it's meant to me, I have to first say thank you for making this kind of an aliyah for me. If I get the sense of an aliyah being an uprising, a rising up, and a coming up and an honor, it's a great, great, great honor for me because I'm a guy who was born in the Bronx. I was born in Eisenhower's 50s, you know, in the Bronx, what great good fortune to be born in this country and to be born after the Second World War, when the men, the boys were coming home, the fortunate ones, and we were really at the threshold of fleshing out the meaning of the creed of what Daniel Liebeskind spoke of, which was which is this precious, precious gift we have. And I am here as a 71-year-old guy, you know, but I remember distinctly what those days were like in the Bronx. Henry Miller, I came across something that Henry Miller had written, and he spoke about youth. He spoke about our childhood as a street of early sorrows. Well, he was a great author and a great thinker, but he got that one wrong. If you were fortunate enough to be born in the borough of the Bronx in the 50s, and you lived through the 50s and the 60s, and you lived through some of the difficult times in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, you're filled with a sense of connectivity. And if there's anything that I could say that might be meaningful in terms of explaining the mystery and the magic of existence in my particular life, being a guy who grew up in the Bronx in the 50s, as an adult, I've managed to elude many of the constraints and of work, even though I worked in the New York City Board of Education, in the Bronx for a while. I've been a freelancer and an artist, and I define my role as telling stories. My art is in the service of telling stories, and some of the stories I have from the Bronx inform everything I do to this day. So I just recently submitted a design. This is so apropos, it's uncanny, it's eerie. I just submitted a design for the Bronx Coin Club, who commissioned me to do a coin honoring their 1000th meeting or something. And of course, on the obverse, the heads of any coin or medal is called the obverse, and on the heads I had a portrait of Jonas Bronk. And in the course of what I do, I have to learn, if I'm going to do my job right, I'm going to steep myself in the history. And the reverse of that particular medal had me researching Jonas Bronk's involvement in this wild territory. This was the great, the great unknown territory that was settled by the Northern Europeans, by the Van Cortlandts and the Bronx of the world. It's why the Bronx is the only borough, I'm sure everybody in this room knows it has the article "the," because the pick and flower of New York down in Manhattan, where civilization was, would say, a wife might say to her husband, Henry, I think we ought to take a little trip to the country. The Bronx is, they're a lovely couple. Let's go up and visit the Bronx. So on the back of that medal, I found out that there were treaties forged between the Lenape Indians right here in the Bronx and Jonas Bronk. So every time I do a medal, I learn something. And it never gets old. I'm still learning after all these medals. And some of the artwork that I've done has put me in close connection with the human stories. And I get to research them, I get to distill them, and then I get to put my own personal spin on them. And very often they get selected, and they get selected to actually circulate. The thing that really excites me about medals and coinage is that it's art that travels to the people. It's very democratic. It belongs in this free society. You don't have to pay an admission, which is a great thing about the Bronx Museum, by the way. I love the fact that it's free, like the Bronx Zoo and the Bronx Botanical Gardens were when I was a boy. These objects, these little ambassadors of history, travel amongst the people in a way that's uncontrolled by by review boards or curators, and it's a wonderful, very vital thing. The reason why I'm an artist today, at 71 years of age, is because we used to have territorial kind of, issues with our courts and our streets and our schoolyards, and we'd be challenged for a court. I was the guy who drew the court on the sidewalks, and once some very, very tough guys from Bureau Avenue, I think, came over, and the head guy said, "Leave him alone, he can draw." And he wanted to keep my artwork on the court, and that became my first client.
That's great. So my recommendation is Google him. You'll be astounded what you'll
Yeah.
find that he's done. We're excited that you're part of the class of 17.
I appreciate it so much.
Congratulations. Thank you. Well done. Since we have been talking about public service, I think this next honoree is a standout. Mr. Michael Miller, who has headed the Jewish Community Relations Council for many years and forged relationships with every kind of community imaginable here in New York City to improve relationships among neighborhoods and with people and with businesses and with religious organizations. So he is our next inductee, and the person who will chat him up is Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr.
Michael Miller, congratulations, first of all. So you grew up in the Bronx.
Yeah.
Where?
My parents had me born in Beth Israel Hospital in Manhattan, but we lived on 197th Street and Webb Avenue for 2 years. Get an applause for that or something? And then 1951, I have an older brother, 2 years older, and then a younger sister, older brother David, younger sister Debbie. And when she was born in 51, my parents bought the house on 2619 Davidson Avenue, which is just down the block from the Kingsbridge Armory. And in fact,
You're a West Side boy.
Yeah. So one of your predecessors, Freddie Ferrer, lived on the block. He lived in Mr. Melnick's house, but anyway, we won't get into that.
So
Anyway.
growing up, Michael, did you know that you wanted to be what you are today, a rabbi, someone with JCRC,
Oh, great
traveling?
question.
What did you want to be when you grew up as a Bronx boy?
Okay, great question. I was told, because I don't remember this, that my father was the rabbi in the Kingsbridge Heights Jewish Center on Amos Place, which is, I got half of an applause, which is between Webb Avenue, University Avenue, just north of Kingsbridge Road. And once when I was a little kid and he was giving a sermon, I sat in his chair. And my father was gesticulating with his hands like that, and every time he did that, I did that. And so I wrote what those of you who grew up in my era would know as a composition in school. And I wrote about the fact that I wanted to be like my father when I grew up.
Wow.
I haven't grown up yet, so still working on it.
And so what are your fondest memories? Where are some of the places that you frequented when you were younger? What were some of your hobbies growing up in the Bronx? What are some of those memories that you still hold on to?
So on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, we would take walks. And one of the walks that we took was to NYU Uptown, now Bronx Community College, where they had a Hall of Fame, which we didn't call the Hall of Fame, which we called the Fall of Haim. Don't ask me. Don't ask me. And of course, taking a short walk from our house up to the reservoir, to the Jerome Park Reservoir, walking around the reservoir, which is a beautiful walk. And for those of you, again, who grew up in that neighborhood, that's where now Lehman College, then Hunter Uptown. Across from Hunter Uptown, in what's now the parking lot, believe it or not, there was an anti-aircraft emplacement And so that memory just has stuck in my head. And then a third walk, as we walk south, and we walk north. So to walk east, somebody mentioned it, maybe Daniel Liebeskind, and that's the Poe House, the Poe Cottage.
Yes.
Now, Poe Cottage wasn't always there at Kingsbridge Road and the Grand Concourse. It was moved there from, I think, from Fordham Road. And speaking of Fordham Road, the ice cream parlor that actually might have been kosher, we think it was Jan's. There you go. That was Jan's.
So you were a traveling boy, and now you're a traveling man.
Yeah.
I for one want to thank you for your friendship. The fact that you have these trips to Israel. First of all, how many folks that are not Jewish have you taken to Israel? And what do you hope comes out of these trips? What do you hope that people gain when they go to, for me, I want to thank you because we become close. You've taken me to Israel twice. You've allowed for a young Puerto Rican from the South Bronx to know what a kibbutz is and experience that. I've gone to the Golan Heights. These trips have been spiritual, cultural. They've been educational for me. And in fact, the last trip resulted in this very building where we hosted the president of Israel, Ruben, right here with Latino ministers. We went there. You took me to him first,
Right.
and then that trip resulted in him visiting us in the Bronx here. But what do you hope that people get out of this?
Well, my first trip to Israel was in 1961. And that experience seared me in a very positive way for life, along the lines of what you were discussing. And then I was there for 66 to 68 studying, there during the Six-Day War, which once again reinforced that relationship. And I had dreamed of taking other people to Israel and afforded that opportunity through the Jewish Community Relations Council, and 3 of our board members are here. One of them is Jeff, sitting behind me. We've taken over 1,000 non-Jewish influentials like yourself to Israel. I've had the fortune of accompanying more than 90 different missions. Wow. And our objective is exactly, you've spelled it out, Mr. Borough President. I don't think I have to say anything else. I think that your identification with Israel was born out of your experience in Israel yourself. And we have several people who are in the audience today, if they want to raise their hands, who traveled on missions to Israel with us. And I'm sure they would, there's one in the back, over there, over here. So we've brought back people who might not live on a kibbutz, but experience the kibbutz and can bring the message and lesson of Israel as a Jewish state, but as a democratic state, as a free state, where people, I heard from somebody, he'll know who he is in a moment, that he told us that when he came back to America, he felt again like a black man. In Israel, he didn't feel like he was black. He felt like he fit in. When you were in Israel, you might not have felt like a Puerto Rican.
Not at all.
Rabbi Green.
I was Ruben.
Rabbi Greenberg.
I was Ruben.
Rabbi Greenberg in the back, ready naming Ruben. Anyway, Juliet's gonna pull us off in a sec.
So I just wanted to thank you as president of God's country. You're being recognized today for doing God's work to the Bronx Jewish Hall of Fame. Here you go, my friend.
Very good.
Well done.
Nicely done. Our next honoree has served the Bronx and Bronx interests for her entire professional life. I knew her from the city council, where she worked for 23 years representing Bronx. And prior to that, she came into all this through the Lindsay administration. And I understand there are some people here from the Lindsay administration. Yeah, see that? Congratulations. And she's consulting today. She's still doing work for her community as well. Our next honoree into the Hall of Fame is Miss June Iceland. Congratulations.
So June, your entire career has been in one way or another involved in community service, in helping people, and politics is not the only thing you've been involved with. So let's go back a little bit and tell me some stories, I know you have some, about your early days in the Bronx.
My first entry into public service, so to speak, was organizing my tenants association, which anybody who's done that knows what it's like. And there are constituents right here in this audience that were in that building. It was supposed to be a luxury building in Riverdale. $175 a month for a one-bedroom. But there were no street lights. There were wires hanging out of the building when we moved in. The place was an absolute mess, and we were all furious. So I organized 1,500 families. And I say that with a shrug. When I told my mother what I was doing, she said, "You didn't organize your closet. How could you possibly do that?" And she was absolutely right. Then Council Member Mario Morola took me under his wing, and he said, "Junie, I'll tell you everything you gotta do and I'll teach you, but you gotta carry it out." I said, "You got a deal." And we got everything fixed. We got a rollback because some of the luxury, quote unquote, things that were supposed to be there weren't there. That was really my first foray into public life. And I guess the next one was John Lindsay. I was a volunteer for him. Fabulous at that time. John Lindsay did some terrific things, and the city didn't burn thanks to him during those awful years. But I wasn't looking for a job. I was a young mom, and they offered me a job and I couldn't refuse. And so that was really wonderful. And of course it was working where I lived in the Bronx. And I got to meet a lot of different people in a lot of different areas other than Riverdale. And it was really very interesting. I got to literally open Co-op City. I was sent over there because there were, again, some problems. And the mayor's office sent me over there through the mayor's Urban Action Task Force. I know you Lindsay-ites remember that well. Rabbi Goldstein has got his thumb up. And that was a very interesting time for me, and I am still friends with many people that I met in the Lindsay administration. Oh, one of the main ones is Sid Davidoff, who I met at that time and who hired me in the Lindsay administration.
Did being a member of not only the larger Bronx community, but the Jewish community in particular, give you a sense of partnership with others in the community and a sense of identity as a Jew in the Bronx? Talk a little bit about what being Jewish meant to you.
Well, the borough president said something very interesting about the population of Jewish people in the area that I lived. And in the 60s, when I started this career of organizing, there were not a lot of Jews in Riverdale. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and it wasn't always the most comfortable place in the early years. But when I discovered that the teaching rabbi at the Riverdale Temple had been my teacher at another synagogue, it was like coming home. And today, when I think of the Bronx Jewish Community Council, and I think about the Riverdale Jewish Community Council and some of the other organizations that I volunteered for or that gave money to places that I discovered not-for-profits that needed services, I think about these people and I realize, I mean, they were selfless, are selfless because they're still working and doing this. And the Jewish community was very well organized. And I think everybody will agree with that. They whether you were a newcomer to the Bronx or a newcomer to this country and you were Jewish, you looked for the identity, and that happened in the Bronx very easily.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your service for decades to the Jewish people and the people of the Bronx, and congratulations.
Congratulations.
I'm just going to add one thing. I just want to tell you a quick story. Mayor Koch made me the representative to the National League of Cities, and that was 5,000 council members, aldermen, mayors, etc. And I actually rose through the ranks and became the chair of the executive board for that organization. They kept giving me a badge that said, representing New York City, and I kept giving it back and saying, no, you must put on it, the Bronx.
Well, talk about previous administrations. He was very heavily involved with working for them and political leaders in the city and in the state. He is now in the field of finance, doing much more wonderful work there, and he is back with us. Please welcome our next inductee, Mr. Jeffrey Weisenfeld, and Howard Teich.
Jeff, you and I go back a long way. And
back when you were a leftist.
And the thing about Jeff, and incredibly we agree on more things than not these days, is you can talk about the titles he has, whether it be Folksbiene, whether it be the people he worked for, whether it be D'Amato, whether it be Governor Pataki, the leadership on the board of CUNY, but that's not what makes Jeff special. What makes Jeff special, and it's the true essence of leadership, this is a man who speaks out, not comfortably for everybody, but telling it as it is. I have the most enormous respect for you, Jeff, and you know that, as what I term the true leader of our Jewish community today, in speaking out on issues that must be said, that aren't hidden, sometimes intolerant, but most often correctly and making a difference. Where does the Bronx come into that?
So I'm reminded of the scene in an Abbott and Costello episode where Costello encounters a crazed individual who shudders at the mention of the term Niagara Falls. And he begins by saying, mine's rather a sad tale, would you like to hear it? You're going to hear it anyway. When I meet great people like this from the Bronx, and I do very frequently, my wife is a witness to that, I'm jealous of them, and I'm going to tell you why. Because almost inevitably, they have one of two characteristics, or they have both. The first one, they're 10 years older than me. The second is that they left their neighborhood earlier than I did, but I should have added a third. They almost always lived in a better neighborhood than I did. See, the problem is the very early years were beautiful years, my first 10 years. Yes, it's been mentioned the Bronx Zoo was free. My father was a factory laborer. We were quite poor. We lived on the 6th floor of one of the few 6-story walk-up buildings, 2244 Morris Avenue, between 182nd and 183rd, where a police officer was murdered recently, by the way, female police officer. And those were beautiful times. Crumbs, Jans, go on the Sabbath after synagogue to the zoo for free. We're sitting in my Talmud Torah right now, this building. This was the Young Israel, the Grand Concourse, and this synagogue very much reflects my experience, and I'll tell you why. It was the largest Jewish investment that I know of in a community that was on the cusp of a massive decline. This synagogue was built 5 years before the Bronx saw its very difficult years. But the first 10 years were great. There's a lesson in what I had later. You'll remember recently there was a young man who was, by all accounts, bullied in school very recently here in the Bronx. And he ended up killing his classmate. This story resonates with me more than any other, because by the time I was 11 and 12, I went to Wade Junior High School on Morris Avenue. It was more a prison camp than a school. By the late 60s, that area of the Bronx where I lived, Mount Hope Place, was a very bad area. We lived in cultural isolation. Most of the Grand Concourse was sucked out to Co-op City, and we were so poor we couldn't even buy shares to get to Co-op City. Bronx science was the thing that saved my life, because the Taft that I would have gone to is not the Taft that Marvin Scott went to. My message about the Bronx is there were beautiful memories. There was a toughening. It makes you tough, because I had to learn how to survive in a very difficult environment. No child should ever be subject, ever, to the lack of attention and provision of safety in any school, ever. That's my lesson, because I lived it. And that's why that young fellow, it's a terrible thing, terrible crime he committed. But God knows what he went through up to that point from bullying. And bullying can have racial overtones, it can have economic overtones, it can have all kinds of overtones. Now, as far as good stuff, going back to the early years, we're sitting 3 blocks from Girard Avenue from the Concourse Cabana Club. Anyone want to take a swim under the L? This was the youngers of the Grand Concourse, Sol's Delicatessen on East Tremont Avenue. East Concourse Hebrew Center was the Saturday shul. This was the Talmud Torah. I got the knuckles to prove it. I was not a good guy, but that's the story.
So Michael and Ruben were talking about the trips to Israel. And this being the 70th anniversary, I look at it from the point of view of what we need to do to stand up for it. And from the early days of the Bronx, which you will hear about that time soon afterwards, to now as we reclaim Judea and Samaria and we do other things there and stand up for things. What does it mean to you now that we're here tonight and we're remembering your early days in the Bronx?
The greatest thing about tonight is that we're here in the Bronx celebrating at the same time the 70th anniversary of partition. I remember when the Six-Day War broke out, because we are the only end of the family. My parents, my brother and I were born here in the Bronx, of course. My parents were Holocaust survivors. Everyone else after the war went to Israel. By happenstance, we ended up here. It was kind of lonely on the holidays. And it was terrifying when everyone was living there and we heard about the Six-Day War. Even worse, because we were in Mount Hope Place till 1973, so we were there for the Yom Kippur War. Israel means everything to me, second only to my own country, but in a spiritual way as well. Without airing too much dirty laundry, it disturbs me very much that there are too many Jews who take Israel for granted. There's a fellow that you know very well, as I do, Erwin Hochberg, a great leader in the Jewish community, passed away last month. And he once gave a speech to a group of kids who really felt no connection to Israel, Jewish kids. And he says, you know, as long as Israel didn't exist, we Jews were always the most persecuted in the world. We were subject to inquisitions, to the Holocaust, to everything under the sun. This was our lot, and we were destined to live with that. But once Israel has been created, every Jew around the world, wherever he is, and they can't live in too many places anymore, besides Canada, Israel, and the United States, and a very few other places. As you know, Europe is going back to its old ways. But if, God forbid, something were to really jeopardize Israel, I think, and Erwin said, and I quote, there will be no third temple. It would be the end of the Jewish existence. The demoralization would be such that we would disappear, because he said, why do people not give enough respect to gypsies, to Roma people? Because a people without an ancestral home are not respected with dignity. And that's the essence of the Jewish people as well. So that's what Israel means to me.
Well, we're thrilled that you're now part of the class of 17 in the Bronx Jewish Hall of Fame. Thank you, Jeff.
Now, our final honoree is Mr. Ron Bloomberg, who was the former New York Yankees slugger and baseball's first designated hitter. He wrote a book, and it was called Designated Hebrew. Yes, well, he was unable to be here tonight, but accepting the award is renowned Yankee author Marty Appel. If you're a Yankee fan, I'm sure you have his books on your shelf. I have my Marty Appel Yankee library at home. And he had forged a close relationship with Ron at the time because they were both working for the team, and he actually wrote the foreword of the book. So he and I are going to speak. So you wrote the foreword of this book. You actually had a good friendship with him at the time. Both of you were on the team. Tell us about this unique role that he played, not only in baseball, but on the Yankees.
Well, the Yankees weren't exactly famous as a Jewish organization. But they always knew that to have a Jewish player, an everyday player, would be great for attendance. And they drafted Ron #1 in the nation in 1967 out of Druid Hills High School in Atlanta, where he was a high school phenom. And the hope was he'd become a great star with the Yankees and attract a lot of Jewish fans, most of whom had moved out of the Bronx by then. But in any case, he might have been that good of a player. He was just subject to a number of career-shortening injuries along the way. But he had this one great distinction in 1970, and by the way, he hit .293 in his career, which is pretty good. He had this distinction in 1973. The American League had adopted the designated hitter rule, which is still controversial today. But in 1973, it was unique and new, and somebody was going to be the first DH and make history as such. And that turned out to be Ron. We were playing in, I was the PR director. We were playing in Fenway Park, opening day, and Ron was to hit 6th in the lineup. So a series of events had to occur for the #6 hitter to get to bat in the top of the first inning. And that's exactly what happened. He came up, the bases were loaded, he walked, a run scored, and I brought the bat up to Cooperstown, to the Hall of Fame, and it's the only bat in Cooperstown honoring a walk. But he became, historically, the first DH, and still lives in Atlanta today. I know he would have loved to have been here for this and would have been honored by it. He was an usher at my wedding. We were like brothers, and we went to Israel together 10 years ago for the Israel Baseball League, which was an attempt to start professional baseball in Israel. And his team won the championship. He was the manager, even though he was the only manager ever to win a championship who never learned the names of any of his players. Everybody was big guy.
How did he seemed, from what I read, handled a lot of this distinction as a Jewish player, which there weren't many of, and as this, with a lot of grace and humor. How did he handle this, and with fans?
He was a natural. He really adjusted to it well. He embraced it. He would wait every day for his bagel lady to show up to bring him bagels at Yankee Stadium. He was all over TV in those days doing interviews with Marv Albert and Dick Schaap and all the ones who were big stars back then. And he just basked in it. He was a natural on camera. He embraced his Judaism. He was a great ambassador.
Did both of you become friends because you were both like Jewish guys in the organization, or you just sort of hit it off and got along?
I suppose that had something to do with it, but he was just the kind of guy you gravitated to. And not a lot of ball players would go out to dinner with the PR guy. They sort of congregated together. But he was like open to anything, and so we sort of bonded and we became good friends. He would go out with sports writers to dinner. That's unthinkable today.
And these days today, do you speak with him? Because I think we're going to try to get him here on the phone. Can we do that?
I lived my dream. You know, I lived my fantasy to be able to play with the New York Yankees and put those pinstripes on. I played a kid's game, and I loved every minute of it. Being part of, I'm very, very proud to be Jewish, and to be able to live up in Riverdale, where I live, and to be able to be focused on my Judaism up there, and to be able to be put into the Bronx Hall of Fame, you couldn't find anything better than this. This is wonderful, and I really appreciate everybody being up there. And when I come up there for Passover, I want to make sure that everybody invites me over to their house.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for coming and accepting this and telling us these great stories. And thank you all. This has been just a fabulous education with these wonderful honorees. I think everybody's learned so much from this, and we look forward to next year's honorees as well.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.